And we've used up about 1 day out of that 5 days. So we instantly shift the conversation from a scarcity problem to a conversion problem. Right? Already this year, solar energy is cheaper in India than fossil fuels. And so we're starting that crossover point, and we're very optimistic about solar because solar energy is now on a doubling pattern. Over the last 10, 12 years, it's been doubling in its price performance every 22 months, very steadily. And today it's 0.12% of energy supply, and it's doubling every 22 months. That means in 8 or 10 years, it's 15%. 2 years after that, it's 30%. 2 years after that, it's 60%. And we think within a couple of decades, we don't have an energy problem. Even if you take synthetic biology, Craig Venter is producing algae to work on biofuels. An acre of biofuels will produce about 10,000 gallons of fuel. The disaster that is the ethanol corn policy in the U.S., an acre of corn will produce about 16 gallons of fuel. So we're set to see some pretty dramatic changes via solar or biofuels in the energy equation. So let me invite you two to sit down. And are there any questions that people have before we kick off? Yeah.
Water.
Yes. So water, I'll say two things about water. The first thing about water is that it's an energy-driven equation because the energy required to desalinate is very, very high. And as we get through the energy threshold and we have a fair bit of energy, then water ceases to be an issue. When water ceases to be an issue, half of the infectious diseases in the world disappear. So that's actually, we're very optimistic. Peter does a lot of analysis of this in his book called Abundance that's just come out. And he shows that we'll actually get to decent energy and water pretty quickly over the next couple of decades. Specifically around water also, Dean Kamen has been, who invented the slingshot and invented the Segway, etc., has been working on a machine that will clean water using a centrifuge, etc. And he just announced, last week we did an event in Hollywood at Fox Studios, that he's got this machine where you have a hose on one end where you put in anything wet, sludge, sewage, anything you want, and out the other side comes out absolutely pure clean water. It will do about 1,000 liters a day. Was that the statistic? About 1,000 liters a day, and it operates on a 100-watt light bulb equivalent of power. And he signed a deal with Coca-Cola to distribute this all around the world. So I think we're going to see some pretty dramatic impacts on water over the next year, 2 years, 5 years. Okay. Other questions? Yeah?
What about new cures, new medicines? I mean, while technology is improving in the identification of targets, the process is still so heavy and bureaucratic that it's slowing down. It's not accelerating.
Right. So the question is, why isn't the process of, let's say, new drug discovery accelerating? In some ways, it's partially a regulatory process. The FDA is not keeping up, for example, with all these exponential technologies. Part of it is that future medicines are going to be much more personalized, as Raymond and I discussed, and so it's hard to do a clinical trial on an N of 1, or you have to reinvent some aspects of that. To their credit, the FDA is trying to look at how to speed things up. For example, maybe using apps or other ways to track clinical trials more effectively and look at side effects. But there are some new applications that are exponential that are affecting drug discovery. So, for example, you can now predict protein structures and design drugs to fit them so you can speed up the selection process. In the world of stem cell biology, we're familiar with embryonic stem cells, which are just entering the clinic, but now we can create your own, basically, stem cell lines from your skin and use that to study your own diseases or screen and understand, let's say, Lou Gehrig's disease from neurons that are based on you. So there are things that are speeding up in the discovery process. Translating that to the clinic, because of many of the regulatory barriers, is still very expensive and is now moving, let's say, to India and China and other places. So I'm sure companies like Teva and others are reinventing some of that process. But some of these technologies, from robotics to stem cells, are speeding up ability to discover new capable meds.
And I'll just shout if that's okay. Can you guys hear me?
Oh, I got it.
Yeah. And genetics and DNA synthesis, DNA reading is able to produce a similar effect. Cancer actually becomes a low-hanging fruit for some of these technologies. We've done work where we will sequence a cancer tumor, identify the genes that have mutated, and then say, here's the list of medicines we can use and can't use. Whenever you look at breast cancer is no longer a single disease. Doctors already treat it as 5 separate diseases, and they prescribe different actions for each one based on the genetics of the tumor that they get from DNA tests. And really, whenever you look a little deeper, the work that we've done in the lab, breast cancer is easily about 105 diseases, and each one, some of them are still, unfortunately, we don't have good cures or treatments, but many of them we do. So it becomes very personalized.
There's actually a multiplier effect happening, right? One is that as we're able to get more data about what's happening, it gives us more clarity. And then as we get more medicines or tools to actually impact it, the multiplier effect actually gives us huge amounts of treatments that are multipliers of effectiveness compared to the previous generation. Okay? Question or comment?
I'm not even quite sure how to
Complaint?
The world has different kinds of problems, many of which interfere with the use of all this brilliant stuff that you're developing, such as religion, such as what we call terrorism, such as what we call, I mean, there are factors here, enormous tribal disputes in countries, daily massacres. How do you, I mean, what is the grounds for optimism about the future of the planet where a bunch of crazies can blow up, acquire nuclear weapons, and destroy us?
So actually, about 4 years ago, I gave a talk at a conference, and I was very worried because I did a graph showing that the amount of damage that one person can do is growing up exponentially, and our ability to maintain and control one person is going down exponentially, and where those cross is a really bad inflection point, and boy, that gap widens, right? And after having been through kind of the 3.5 years of Singularity University and listened to the speakers, etc., I've actually come away much more optimistic than I came in. And the reason behind that is 2 or 3-fold. The first is that we found that on an open system, Craigslist, for example, is an open environment where people can do good things or bad things. And the number of good things tends to outweigh the number of bad things on something like a 10,000 to 1 ratio. Now, if the amplitude of the bad things is really high, that doesn't help you very much, right? True. And I was very concerned until we find that using Facebook and so on, there's a social mitigator to disastrous consequences where we've simply not seen people exposed to the modern world and modern communications. There's a constraining mechanism, a social and mesh that's happening that prevents people from going as crazy as they used to. We've had am I off the record here or am I on the record? I'm going to go off the record for a minute, so just as you clip on this, just do this. We've had the heads of innovation for both the CIA and the Department of Defense come through our programs. And we asked the head of the CIA, look, how do you think about bioterrorism, which is a massive issue where anybody can go off and probably are trying to create viruses in their garage, and the tools and information are readily available. And he actually had a much more inspiring an answer than I expected. He said, look, when you have something like nuclear weapons where you know the numbers and you know where they are, you put eyes on them and you watch them like hell. In an environment like bioterrorism or where people can do bad things, what they're doing is actually funding the community and opening it up. Because today, to do something interesting, you actually have to collaborate with other people. And by actually funding the open source environment, if anything is happening, they actually spot it much more quickly. I was actually floored by the wisdom in that approach. I wouldn't have expected that from a government agency, frankly. And so we're seeing that happen in domain after domain. Now, when you actually look, I'll pass it over. When you actually look at the hard statistics in the world, we're geared to find bad news, right? Our amygdala filters for bad news. And that's a genetic evolutionary thing. If there's a rustle in the bushes and I think it's just the wind, the tiger can eat me and my genes don't progress. And which is why bad news sells. But in reality, when we look at many of the statistics in the world today, the number of deaths by war today is lower than it's ever been. Extreme poverty over the last 30 years has dropped 75%, according to the UN, globally. When they talk about poverty in the U.S. and they say there are 30 million people that are in poverty in the U.S., 90% of them have a refrigerator, a mobile phone, a car, air conditioning. If you went back 100 years and tried to find somebody with a mobile phone, refrigerator, you'd pick the richest people in the world, and they didn't have that. So we're actually changing the bar very, very quickly. It's just that our heads are so geared towards seeing these things, we don't see the good things. Okay? So that's I'm sidestepping the question to some extent, but I think there's some real. We don't look at it in a balanced way. We're not geared that way.
And I was just going to take off a little bit on that. There's in Silicon Valley, there's this great myth that's really true about the garage innovator. We have biohackers working in garages on different things, and that worries a lot of people. So one of the things that we've done as a nonprofit is formed a community lab, and all these people who are working on different projects, they brought their equipment into a public place that is very open. People can come, learn, participate. A lot of the folks who have done very well with these biotechnology companies are taking these, for instance, $500,000 sequencers and saying, how can I make this handheld so that I can put it in a backpack and take it into the wilds of Africa and do scientific work or medical work off the grid? A lot of the people are doing just great work there. The other thing, the question we get the most often at the hackerspace, the biohacker space, is how is it possible that people let you do this? Isn't there a law against this? The law enforcement community, the security community loves us. The FBI are one of our best friends. We deal with them much more easily than we do with the city of Sunnyvale about trash collection. The FBI comes by all the time and they want to know what people are working on, and not in an invasive way, but what's going on. We want to keep up with the trends that are here so we don't erroneously think somebody's doing something bad. We want to know who to talk to there if somebody is doing something bad. So that's a good thing for us.
Yeah, I just want to make one more comment. Now, that's not to say there's not negative things happening, right? We actually have our head of policy, law, and ethics is actually the futurist for the FBI. And he does a whole series of talks where he talks about how are the negative elements, terrorists, criminals, etc., using these same tools with impunity because they're not constrained by trying to do the right thing or constrained by regulatory frameworks. And the ability of, can you hear me okay? Or you just right? Okay. The ability of criminals to use these tools is just as high as anybody else. So in the terrorist attacks in Bombay 3-4 years ago, when the Indian SWAT team landed on the roof of the Chabad house, somebody twittered the picture of that. The terrorist war room back in Pakistan saw this and texted them saying, the SWAT team has just landed, go to the northeast corner and kill them. So they're operating in real time just as the information is flowing. And how the hell do you come? So there is all sorts of negative things, and we have a lot more time to discuss those during our major programs. It's just hard to do that in a small environment. Question there, and then we'll go to the back. Yeah?
So everything we've heard here is very inspiring. I'm really worried about the 2000/80 ratio that you're talking about. And the issue is scale. How are you going to scale this inspiring idea? Create something that's really hard.
How do we scale SU is what you're asking. So one way we're doing it is these contests. It's not a great way, but I think what's happened is that it's clear that we've hit a zeitgeist for how to approach this type of problem that seems to work. We're layering on top of traditional higher education. We want our students to have deep depth in one area and then be able to go interdisciplinary and point them at these biggest problems. What we're starting to do is partner with organizations around the world, and where we can kind of just, for example, what if we took our curriculum and just open sourced it to people and let people say, we're constantly curating the latest breakthroughs, go look at those and teach the ones that you want to get across to your high school group, your student groups, etc. And so we're looking at things like that to expand it. We've already seen people taking the model and starting to use it, and great. We to see that. I think what you'll see is where people will take this model and then localize it for their region, for their expertise in their areas, etc. We actually had a meeting with the IDC about that this morning. Okay, there's a question in the back, and we'll go here. Yeah. What about?
Reading
How can you live longer?
Stop smoking. Oh, this is really smoking. What the hell? Drive slower. I mean, there's a lot of... Singularity University is not about... There are people who come very interested in longevity. We've had Aubrey de Grey and others come. I think the question of aging and how to attack that is maybe your question, and there's multiple paths. How do you measure aging? It's many different things. And there's certain elements from genetics and understanding how we can take worms, change one gene, and C. elegans, they can live 5 times longer. How to maybe implement that through gene therapy. There's resveratrol and other sort of compounds that may affect those pathways. The best thing everyone here can do to live longer is exercise 30 minutes a day. It's better than any other drug, seriously, for all sorts of things. So the things you can do individually today, there's some example like taking vitamin E and a few other nutrients can help in general. But in terms of science as applied to living longer, there's a lot of work in the field that I focus mostly on regenerative medicine, how we can use stem cells to either regenerate organs, replace them. The merger of 3D printing, for example, with stem cells is sort of on the early stage. For about a decade, there have been bio-generated bladders. Last year, there were 2 trachea that were sort of 3D printed and seeded with the patient's own stem cells. So we're starting to be able to replace simple organs, and the hope is eventually we can basically print a kidney, for example, and we're at the stage now where you can basically 3D print blood vessels. The final frontier there is still really the brain. If you have all your organs working but you have Alzheimer's, it's like a so what question. And we're now at the era where we're starting to have biomarkers that might pick that up earlier scans, and hopefully potentially some smart therapies, whether they're stem cell or drug-based, or brain games even. So I think the answer to live longer, aside from exercise, stop smoking, is a multitude of things that are going to integrate. Some of those are public health, some of those are vaccination, some of those are antivirals and things that will prevent pandemics, etc. That's all.
That makes sense. Yeah. On the aging side, I mean, there are predictions that we will break through the aging barrier in about 25 years, right? And we'll reach what's called escape velocity, which means that for every year that goes by, we'll figure out how to add more than 1 year to your life. Important to know, we're not a research institution. We're curating and watching for what's happening elsewhere. If that happens, we think a great deal about the societal impacts of that. Right? What happens when one class of the population is living for a very long time and the gap is growing? How do we deal with healthcare costs? I mean, there's all sorts of huge issues that we don't have a full answer to. We're kind of the forum where we actually have those discussions. Okay? There's a question over here.
Okay, I was inspired by the position. I can see the hurdles, and I think in my mind that oversimplification of the value of technology and development of new education simplifies the issue. And there are 3 hurdles which I see and I'd like to hear what you think about. The first is regulatory, which you mentioned, the second one is the availability ones. Many people feel that they apply from critical diseases. The third issue, not all issues, but the third issue is the economy of the large of the big pharma and the need to about the short longevity of the patents both for 20 years. And the big one is the cost of medicine by itself, where wealthy nations cannot pay the burden of the increasing costs. So being in a nation which is a startup nation, we have 700 medical device companies, and I don't know how many types of are. Many of them very good, and you mentioned the field, to the point where I think there's a point in having learning this present all times in this is like innovation. But I'd like to hear your thoughts about the hurdles. It's not the invention, it's the blocks.
So the question there is, there's also things that, but what are the hurdles and not just the regulatory ones? Daniel.
Well, a couple of the hurdles are simply, let's say, physicians and adoption. And like Peter says, you get what you incentivize. At least in the medical world, if physicians incentivize to do a biopsy or a bypass or a transplant, that's what happens more often than not. So as we change the incentives, at least in the United States, we have accountable care organizations, ACOs, that are adopting. So you get paid more to keep your patients healthy. And Medicare, which funds most of the elder care in the U.S., is now, this new mantra for innovation is better care at lower costs. We're not going to pay for new devices that are more expensive. unless they dramatically lower costs. So part of the regulatory and incentive things are shifting, at least in the U.S., so that if we have a device that can cure hypertension instead of giving drugs, like there's a couple devices, one I saw today at this Rainbow Medical Device Group, that might take over. But the barriers are high. Some of the barriers are, again, regulatory. We can apply some technologies to crowdsource and do clinical trials. Raymond's a co-founder of a company called Genamera, where everyone in this room could create your own clinical trial and see the effect of, was it butter on memory? So there's smarter ways potentially to improve these cases. But again, a lot of it is where you put the target, and some of that may be to targeting, prevention as opposed to therapy. That's one part.
I was going to say, too, that some of these we just don't have great answers for, the regulatory pieces especially. And some of that, I don't really want a regulatory agency that exponentially decreases its time to approve things. I like that they take a long time and are careful. However, some of the technologies are improving so quickly that what we're really seeing, people are finding their own uses for them, and they're dragging then their doctors with them. They're dragging regulatory agencies into it, and so far that has been for the better. The piece too that I think that we get concerned about is funding, and there seems to be a funding disparity where capital wants to go to quick successes, and I worry that we're going to have really, really great iPads that we can all play with when we have Alzheimer's, right? Because nobody's funding those pieces. However, what seems to be happening is a lot of the pieces that go into making the technologies, it's ridiculous how fast the price for that is decreasing and how wide the adopters are who are playing with these technologies and trying to find new things to do. The final thing I'll add, because we ought to take more questions and not talk, is a lot of these medical technologies are less and less about, we found some random drug by digging up a plant in the Amazon and trying it on a bunch of things, and more about very directed platforms where you say, here is something that works on a lot of different things. We actually have one of the Singularity U graduates here who is working on a platform device that works on as an antiviral for a huge spread of things, and I got to see some research they're doing today. It works for things beyond that. It's amazing, and we're seeing more and more technologies that have wide application.
I think we rely a great deal on, from the hurdles point of view, we're seeing a very, very rapid democratization of technology, right? If you went back 10, 12 years, we didn't really use mobile phones, search engines, or social networks. The world is unbelievably different today. And the cost of this, when it first came out, was big and clunky and really expensive and didn't really work very well. As the cost drops and as more investment goes in, it's become unbelievably inexpensive. We're seeing that in sensors and so on. As we get all of this new data, I think we'll figure it out. It's empowering every individual to do their own thing. And I think we'll see a lot more of that. Nobody today goes to their doctor without looking up all the symptoms on Google. Right? And we'll see more and more of that as AI comes to bear on some of these areas. There's a question there, and then we'll go there. Yeah.
You mentioned about less soldiers being killed in wars because of this.
Less people.
Less people.
Yeah.
Because of this technological advancement. But you clearly see that the main target now in wars is not. It's basically the citizens themselves, not to kill them, but to create something that will disable their abilities. What's your opinion about it?
Well, I think what we'll do is we'll see war shift more to the information side, hacking, cyber terrorism, on that score of things. So now as we turn the world into information, that becomes an increasing weakness. And so we're seeing the Chinese are constantly hacking away at Google and whoever else. We'll see conflict hit more and more of that world than the pure physical side of things. So I think we'll see a lot more of that happening.
Should we continue this progress?
Well, should we continue or not is that's actually a really important question. What we found is the progress will, once you ground a domain or discipline in this information capability, the progress happens no matter what. And we see that in those curves. George Bush tried, for ideological reasons, to restrict stem cell research in the U.S. all the researchers went to China and Canada, and stem cell research continued absolutely without stopping. And so we found that the progress was going to happen, and for us, as we spot that that's going to happen no matter what, we think about the mitigation of that, and how do we handle it, and how do we harness it, rather than trying to stop it, because we've not found a way of stopping it. Okay? Yeah?
Trying to figure out what is the nature of your institution. Is it finding an exponential solution to exponential problems? Is it all about preparing humanity to this singularity point? Is it Isaac Asimov's foundation?
You know, we had Garrett Lisi, who's a very famous quantum physicist, come and spend a day with us. He's actually working on the grand unification theory and seems to be closer than anybody else. And he spent the day with us, and he said at the end of it, loved it, incredible energy on the campus, etc. But let me ask you a question. You're not really about the singularity. You're not really a university, so what the hell are you? Right? And he's right. I think you could classify us in this way. We're one-third academic institution focusing on these fast-moving technologies. We're one-third think tank thinking about the implications of these in different domains. And we're one-third incubator where we're actually actively working on projects that can harness these technologies to address global issues. Where you have global challenges, you also have the biggest markets in the world, right? Energy is an $8 trillion market. And so if you can address that with some technology that can scale, and entrepreneurs are always looking for what is a great solution that can scale easily. And when we bring together this combination of very powerful technologies, you're hearing a couple of these here today, mix that in with robotics, autonomous vehicles, AI, big data, feedback loops, gaming, etc., nanotechnology, material science, the potential becomes extraordinary. And so that cocktail is what we look at. But we're about one-third of each of those is the safest way I can put it. And we have a ton of fun. You can also imagine. There was a question over here. Yeah.
When you talk about singularity point, I claim that we as humans, we really don't change over the century. The basic hierarchy of needs that Maslow defined is the same basic hierarchy of needs. We need food and sex and sleep.
Yes.
And we behave the same. Now, technology enables your percentage of the population to have more resources. You know, Maslow defined self-fulfillment only those that can have the resources. And the gaps are growing. It's not who is poor that is important today, it's the gap between the two. And the third world and the US, and inside the US itself.
Yeah.
We see fights of religion, of money. This comes from the gaps. And Yankee talked about the need to be responsible, but I claim that we are not responsible. Humanity is not responsible. Look at how the Western world helps countries that have resources, natural resources, and what happens when there's a turmoil in a country that doesn't have natural resources. Where is the responsibility so-called? So the singularity point can be, if you look back at Europe, the nobility and the kings, they have all the riches, and there was a revolution. What prevents singularity point from being a revolution against the new order that is being created by technology?
And your question is? No. Yeah, so I think...
What do you think about it? Because you assume that singularity is the place where technology is going to overcome humanity, and the speed is going to be exponential there.
Right.
Maybe that's the revolution point, where humanity is going to feel technology because of the gaps and the new order that it created. Maybe we should not focus about technology, but about the social needs, social implications of this rapid advancement that we are not dealing with.
So I would absolutely agree that humanity is not fair and not sensible about any of this. I would totally agree with that, right? We're selfish, greedy, self-driven, manipulative creatures, etc. Having said that, I would go back to the point that we made earlier, that when you look at the hard statistics, we're actually in a pretty good position compared to where we could be. And our brains are geared to finding the negative facts. To the point about the gap between the haves and have-nots, yes, you're right. There's a huge structural issue in how we divide resources. And if you're interested in this, I did a TEDx talk called "Occupy Mail Street." It's on YouTube, right? And I make a point that we have seesawed between a male and female archetype to progress civilization over several thousand years. The Renaissance was an opening up of old feudal systems. The last couple of hundred years has been the use of capitalism, the military-industrial complex, in the Industrial Revolution to progress humanity. Those are very top-down, male, I would call them male archetypes, not gender relations. I'm thinking about the archetypes. And we're now seeing an inflection point towards more of the female. The internet, gifting economies, Burning Man, open source, the maker movement is now opening all that up. And what we're seeing is a huge struggle between those two societal shifts. So I'm arguing that we're actually seeing this kind of tipping point between the two. When the male archetype meets abundance, it doesn't relate to it as sharing, it relates to it as power and tries to hoard it. We're seeing that on Wall Street. The female archetype naturally takes it and shares it around it. Okay? And my thesis is that when we look at the Occupy Wall Street movement, the Arab Spring, this is actually the female archetype under a huge amount of stress. And so we're starting the shift, and we need to support many more structures like that. And I think this is where technology comes in. The technology is enabling that to happen, and I don't think you can stop it. I think what we'll see happening is more and more of that. We're seeing the beginnings of that. The SOPA bill in the US was a fabulous example of this, where old Hollywood and the media empires tried to sneak through legislation at Christmas time to completely clamp down on the internet. And at the very last minute, everybody noticed and went, shit, what the hell's happening? Stop all that, and completely undid it all. And we'll start to see that happen. The U.S. today, for example, is not a democracy. You don't earn an election by your ideas. You earn an election by how much money you're able to fundraise, and that usually comes from special interests and so on. And so there's actually a big structural issue in the whole democratic process. And how we fix that, I have no idea. I had a frightening conversation with George Shultz, the former Secretary of State, and I asked him, how bad do you think it is compared to your arc of history where you've seen 4 decades? And he said, it's worse than I've ever seen it. And that was very sobering, and I think that's to your point. But I think somewhere there'll be a correction, and generally when we see what people can do on an individual basis, what technology is allowing us to do, we're expanding the human experience with technology very rapidly, and I think we'll see a lot more of that. We have time for 1 or 2 more comments at the back. Yeah. So your question was, you don't think when we're doing research that we're looking high enough, we're very, very verticalized? Okay.
At least in the medical side, as I mentioned in my talk earlier, we're still very departmentalized by body parts, etc. In the integration of medicine and biology, and you have exponentials for genomics, for proteomics, for your environmental data, for your imaging. There is a new field trying to integrate that holistically called systems medicine or systems biology. So sort of like if you looked at a car taken in thousands of parts and you were trying to diagnose it just from a pile of parts, it's very difficult to do. How to integrate that and find where the problem is, or how to improve things. So there is a whole field trying to integrate that. It's a lot of computation. It's like combining unstructured data with structured information, and that's systems medicine. And that's where I think some of this is heading, and requires an integration of computational skills, big data, analytics, so that we are being holistic, and it's not treating one little protein level in your blood or one symptom, but looking at that in an integrated way. And our therapies will hopefully be much more predictive and targeted to take the whole system into play as well.
You know, one thing that I'm fascinated by is self-awareness. How would we create a test for it? How would you measure self-awareness? How could you measure consciousness? If you're in a meditative state, and we're finding technologies now that can actually measure when you're in a flow state. And I think that's kind of one of those fulcrum points, that when you can do that, then all sorts of other things work. And as we apply technology in the feedback loop of information to that kind of environment, I think it opens up whole new worlds. Daniel showed you the photograph of the Tibetan monk with the emotive headset. I think we'll see a lot more of that. Okay. All right, so I think we've used up all the time that we have. I'd like to thank everybody. Some fantastic questions. We're around a little bit. If you have further questions, grab Raymond or Daniel or myself. And thank you for having us.
Send good applicants.
Say what? Okay. And if you know great graduate students that would benefit from attending Singularity University, point them to our website.